Hi, I'm Diane Hullett, and welcome to the Best Life, Best Death podcast. Today, I've got a really interesting guest. I'm here today with Rob Colbert, and Rob is a licensed professional counselor and a psychotherapist. And I've connected with him through a friend and asked if he would talk to us today about psychedelics at the end of life and psychedelics in general, because I think there's a resurgence in interest in their powerful use as a tool. So, welcome, Rob.
Hi, thanks.
So just kind of give us a little background. How did you come to be doing what you're doing?
Well, it's always a fun question to answer. At the age of 19, I started exploring with drugs. That included a full range, pretty much, MDMA, LSD, psilocybin, even DMT, and some research chemicals. But for me, as a young person, that exploration kind of exposed to me how lacking our drug education was. The first time I did MDMA, I was, hit with this um, heart-opening experience where I wanted to connect with others. And I told my friend, I was like, hey, why don't they use this for couples therapy? And he just kind of laughed at me and said, well, they did before it was made illegal in 1985. And so the light bulb went off, and I was like, well, wow, this is crazy. We really need to do more research on this if this could be beneficial for people. And so that kind of set off a long trajectory of both my own personal self exploration, but then also kind of exploring ways to help advocate for that. And so um later in life it led towards seeking a degree in transpersonal counseling psychology at Naropa University. And I appreciated transpersonal because in the grand scheme of things, it's kind of a turn in humanistic psychology from just the humanistic pieces and raising to self-actualization, to also addressing spirituality or some of these bigger ineffable concepts in life. And so a lot of that had related to my use with substances and just saying like, oh, there were some epiphanies that came out of these trips or these experiences that really did impact me and how I pursued my own life goals, my purpose, my relationships. And I really did consider it a healthy turn, right? Like, of course, these drugs could cause trouble, but I was finding that in a lot of ways, it deepened my connection with other people, deepened my connection with the planet. And I just wanted to really advocate for that further. And so, yeah, in a nutshell, that's kind of how I ended up an advocate and as a psychedelic therapist today.
So interesting. When we were talking at the beginning, you said that you went to Naropa for this transpersonal psychology, and then you also went on and got a PhD in anthropology, and like how those must influence each other in your work. It's got to be really a powerful sort of, you got powerful tools from both of those to come to where you are.
Yeah, I like I said, I consider, the degree at Naropa. It was described once by a friend, said that it was like going to school to be a surgeon, but using your own arm to learn how to operate. Meaning that in the transpersonal counseling, first we had to do our own therapy. And so just like I wouldn't trust a lifeguard who'd never been in the deep end of the pool, it was my own chance to kind of jump into my own deep end and do my personal work there. Actually, in 2010, I also did some work with an underground therapist doing some psychedelic assisted therapies. And part of it was just to kind of explore that outside of just doing the drugs and enjoying, having fun with my friends, but wanted to see how that applied to doing therapy and this deeper work. And it was really a deep dive. And the wild parts about it was in that underground experience, I even uncovered traumas that had existed that were really early in my childhood, maybe 2 weeks old, experiencing traumas. And so it was wild to have that open up, but then also to have a process oriented with that, that then I was grappling with it and seeing the consequences and then how I make meaningful change in my life. So yeah, after that and graduating, going off for my PhD in anthropology and social change, it became kind of the outward exploration of how to take the personal change and turn it into social change. And so yeah, I really appreciated it. It's a radical department that was, yeah, really geared on post-capitalist, post-colonial studies, affirming feminism in the activism that we do. And so I think it really transformed, yeah, my own advocacy and how I act in the world these days.
Absolutely, and kind of shaped your knowing. Well, there's a lot of buzz about psychedelics kind of in the news these days, and how there are these powerful studies coming out about it, their use for trauma and for alcoholism, those kind of places. But before jumping to kind of the current field, can you tell us more about the history? Like, my understanding is that these drugs were being studied sort of in the 40s, 50s, with promising results. So, just give us a little history as a anthropologist.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just to take it all the way back, humans and their curiosity with using substances from their environment to change their mood and behavior goes back thousands of years, of course, right? We've got documentation out of antiquity, and the Eleusinian mysteries, and so it's as an anthropologist, I try and steer away from things that I like called human nature. I think that humanity has got a lot of diversity, and so anything we would say is nature, and kind of bound by it, except for when I talk about this piece with using substances from our environment to change us. And I just think that that really is a natural place that we've leaned into, right? And so whether or not it was the like stoned ape theories of evolution or things like that, but so yeah, of course, Western science started really to try and document some of these things. In some ways, the exploration of these changes to consciousness were used to explore psychosis, right? And so the symptoms that were actually tormenting humans, and scientists wanting a better way to practice with those patients and these kind of states. And so the altered states work was explored from kind of that angle. What was interesting is even early on, it was found that even though these substances might mimic psychosis, the recovery from this was actually really more impactful in people's lives. And so um, researchers like Stanislav Grof, who actually in the Czech Republic um, was researching high dose LSD early on, was finding that people would have these very transpersonal experiences, exploring things like birth trauma, like I described with myself. But what was interesting is that when he would do these high dose sessions, folks would go back to this core trauma that had taken place, and through processing that, then in later sessions would never return to it. So there was this transformation that took place in people's lives that, yeah, seemed pretty well solidified and fixed afterward. And so that's really encouraging, because even with some of the drugs and substances that we see prescribed today, people may take these medications for a long time, but then when they stop, a whole wave of other symptoms come on, sometimes from the withdrawal, but then also, it's not like it cured their depression or cured their anxiety. So they're kind of back to square one. Whereas with working with psychedelic assisted therapies, the ketamine-assisted therapy that I work with folks, we see really meaningful, purposeful changes in people's lives. And the good news is it's not from them taking ketamine every day. It's from having a few meaningful experiences and finding, this purposeful transitions in their life.
And say for, like, if someone's listening and they've not heard of any of these things, like, can you say, like, what's the difference between ketamine versus psilocybin versus MDMA or LSD? I don't know. I mean, obviously
Mhm.
they're all different chemicals, but particularly the ketamine and the psilocybin, how do those differentiate in legality and experience in studies, whatever you know?
Yeah. Well, so psilocybin is the active ingredient in psilocybin mushrooms, magic mushrooms. So that has been around in the human experience for thousands of years. It was made popular in the late 40s, early 50s by ethnobotanists, white medical trained researchers that went out and started researching these. And so the tragedy is they were colonized, right? So they went down to Mexico, found these practices. Mira Sabina was the practitioner who would expose these. And regretfully, because they were hijacked by Western culture, she was actually, ousted from her community. And they were like, "Hey, why'd you do this?" So that was kind of a resurgence of some of the psychedelic research with psilocybin. It was then isolated and then studied on its own. And so that also removes it from the context of using the mushroom and then just using the psilocybin substance. And so For me, one of the benefits of magic mushrooms is that it is a fungus that comes from the earth, and it's got a full range of other useful alkaloids within the substance that also contribute to the experience that people have with it. And so, in isolating it down to just psilocybin and using it, I don't know, it may or may not be as beneficial as like using a whole mushroom. And
Right.
so,
Right. Well,
um,
it's like eating a fresh tomato from the garden versus like a, canned process to tablespoon of tomato. Like they just are different, two different things.
yeah. Or, like eating a jalapeno versus taking just the capsaicin, which is the hot element. And it's
There you
like,
go.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that psilocybin related to, or, compared then to ketamine. So ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic. It was first synthesized in 1962. It was exploring analogs actually to PCP. And so using it as an anesthetic was beneficial because it doesn't lower your heart rate, it doesn't lower your breathing rate. And so doctors and surgeons in combat specifically were able to use this and not have to have someone monitoring vitals while they may do a procedure like an amputation or something like that. So as an anesthetic, it was a great step forward. Also, at that time, the effects of it, the subjective effects that people would experience, were they were reported to be pretty intense, and so it actually led to them seeking further analogs of the anesthesia, ones that didn't create that same kind of experience. But as early as the 70s and 80s, different medical doctors and psychiatrists were exploring this use specifically for those altered subjective effects, right? And so the trippiness, so to say, were explored. First reported like antidepressant effects, people encountering ketamine and just feeling better for the coming weeks, a few days, even up to a couple of weeks or months. And so, that was began the exploration of using like the sub anesthetic doses. And so that's what we lean into these days with ketamine assisted therapy, is actually using doses to where people, especially in my office, they're not fully anesthetized. People are able to talk most of the time. They are able to explore their experience. And so within that, we kind of tap into it and then use it for processing existential material, relationships, identities, really any range of things that could come up during those sessions. So,
So when you work with someone, there's a little bit of a, I'm sure, conversation before, like a setting of intention, kind of a plan for when and how to do that, and then some follow-up. Is it, and so what kind of changes do you see people inhabit?
well, and kind of going to the root of, psychedelic, the word psyche is often translated to mind, but that's pretty limiting. It's actually, in the Greek or Latin translations, could mean soul or spirit. And so it's soul or spirit manifesting as psychedelic. And so within that, it could be any number of things that show up. I've had people who experienced past life experiences, deaths from previous lives, and the encounter of those difficult experiences, and then having them impact us in our lives today here in the 2000s. And so ranges from that to people, like I said, just exploring things that show up in their day-to-day life today. So that's part of why doing preparation, I think, is so important. And so I definitely meet with people before we do ketamine assisted therapy to kind of get a lay of the land. And I want to know about people's religious beliefs or spirituality, thoughts around that, whether they incorporate mystical type experiences or not, or alternative ways of healing, like Reiki or acupuncture, things like that. And so just wanting to kind of get a good idea of how people meet
Mm.
the psyche for themselves, so that then we can kind of know the landscape that we might traverse. And so within that, I've used ketamine assisted therapy for atheists and agnostics, all the way up to folks really devout in their faith, whether it was Islam or any number of sects of Christianity. And so it really is individualized at that piece. I don't claim to be the expert and like trying to purport that one sense of spirituality is the best. It's really just meeting people where they're at. And so, yeah, the preparation side is really purposeful in that. That way, we're kind of prepared for what shows up. And then, just to be honest, every time someone takes a drug or medicine, it's an experiment. And so we don't know what might show up. For instance, one of the folks that reported the past lives piece, that was not in their wheelhouse. They, were not expecting that. However, it didn't change their ability to work with that encounter and make meaningful, yeah, changes in their life afterward. And so that's also that piece of having integration work is just as important, because then one person that I'm working with right now is devout Jehovah's Witness. And so that opening up their connection to their community and their connection to the divine really has transformed how they work with the ketamine-assisted therapy piece. And so yeah, I really find it to be a dynamic tool to work with people. And the great news is I've had people have really meaningful sessions. And so it was just one exposure to ketamine, and we ended up doing therapy for over a year before we did ketamine again. And that created a lot of transformation in their life. So it wasn't like we had to just keep giving them more and more ketamine or having them do it daily. That was actually not the meaningful piece. The ketamine was just kind of like, not as interesting as the existential stuff that opened up afterward.
I just love hearing about that, Rob. That's so interesting to me. This, what you said about kind of, it's a dynamic tool to create meaningful change. And that seems like the real power sort of in terms of these kind of, tools, medicines at the end of life, right? With people who experience an enormous amount of maybe existential angst. I know there's some people with tremendous fear. And my understanding is that these kinds of experiences can really alter someone's experience with how they are heading towards the end of their life. I don't know if you have any specific experiences with people who are facing a terminal illness or diagnosis, but I think it's such a powerful place.
It is. And what I appreciate about it is, of course, living life, as a child, we're kind of like this perfect little being, and then we're exposed to humanity, and any number of terrible things can happen. Any number of wonderful things can happen as well. But then, yeah, as we grow up and grow older, sometimes that veil can become more dense and thick. And so then when we get to the end of life, it can be very, very much provoke a lot of anxiety. People going, oh, what do I do? And where am I at? And what does this all mean? And psychedelics and their ability to kind of um, thin that veil out or even lift it and remove it altogether to remind them of that sense of spirituality that they had as a youngster, or some of these meaningful experiences that they've had, just kind of bring that into the forefront and re-exposes them to it. And so I think that it's that rediscovery or new discovery that makes it meaningful and purposeful. And from my perspective, life is terminal. No one gets out alive. And so within that, that's also how I feel that these are useful, even when we don't have a terminal diagnosis. And so I'm a big advocate that for legalizing these substances, right? The foundations of the Controlled Substances Act were not about protecting people. It was actually about controlling groups of people. And the substances that were targeted were because of the groups of people that were using those, right? And so, the good example of this is, Tylenol is sold over the counter. I could go to 7-Eleven and buy enough right now to kill myself and a couple of other people. So it's not about controlling the substance. It was about controlling the groups of people, right? So psilocybin was identified as being used in Mexico and in indigenous traditions. And so, of course, was demonized and told to be controlled because of those groups of people and the racist context, which existed at that time in the 60s and 70s when this was being formulated. And so the other one that I like to bring up is Dramamine. Dramamine also sold over the counter. Kids can go buy it. You can also go buy enough to have amazingly psychedelic experiences. And it's actually one of the weirdest, strangest trips I ever did as a young person. And so it's not about protecting people, right? The Controlled Substances Act was about controlling groups of people. So in our advocacy, it's really about just confronting that and saying like, no, actually, if it was about protecting people, how can we store bleach under our sink, right? That's extremely harmful.
That's so
So
interesting.
yeah.
It's also, I also think it's really interesting what you said just at the very beginning, going back to that humans have altered their consciousness through substances our entire, as far as we know, the entire human existence. And go back to the stoned ape theory. Like if someone's listening and they haven't heard of that, can you just expound on that for a minute?
I think it was Graham Hancock that wrote about some of this and purported it. Terrence McKenna, maybe. I forget. A lot of the literature kind of like floods in, but basically, is this idea that um, mammals and their ability to seek out substances that transform their thinking was paramount in discovering new things like using fire or making tools. And so, in some ways, it could have been haphazard exposure, just kind of like hanging out in the forest and eating a mushroom and then having major epiphanies. But those epiphanies leading to meaningful transformations in how people communicate with each other. I can't recall the book or its title right now, but it actually explores the usefulness of alcohol and how alcohol's ability to depress things like um, uh, anger,
Inhibitions.
yeah, inhibitions, right? But
Inhibition.
actually
Thank
made it possible for people to come together and not just fight. They would come together, depress some of those, and then have meaningful conversations. And so it's just interesting to see how that mood alteration could have been used in purposeful ways to actually create, yeah, communities coming together and forming society in these larger like contexts. So.
Right, like fermented beverages, essentially, right? I feel like that might have been, there's a book called The Immortality Key, and I can't remember the author of that, but it kind of explores this use of medicines through history to create altered consciousness and altered relationships, right?
That sounds right. That sounds right.
Yeah. So what, let's see, what do I want to ask? I kind of want to be like, so what's the downside? Like I've heard it said like one of the challenges with these substances becoming legal is that then I'm going to call them big pharmaceutical companies are going to kind of sweep in and patent this stuff, which takes it out of the hands of the indigenous cultures and the local growers and that kind of thing. What can you say about that?
Well, yeah, recently Compass Pathways released their information about Compass 360, which is a synthetic extraction of psilocybin, or it's a synthetic form. It's not an extraction, but so yeah, and they come out and they're like, oh, hey, this is useful for depression. I'm like, well, cool, but we already were told that, and so we're already seeing this kind of like big corporations coming out and trying to patent it. Compass was also trying to patent certain aspects of the therapy, like what kind of music and lighting you could use or things like that. And so it's just really interesting to try and patent those kind of things. And of course, that's just based on market capitalism and wanting to have a competitive edge. And so I think that that's actually part of the travesty of popularizing some of these things. First, these are not magic cures. They can really destabilize people. I've definitely worked with people, even with ketamine-assisted therapy, that it was more destabilizing in doing that work. I had one woman, she came in and for the 2 hours that we were in our session, she sat with this deep grief. I mean, she was exposed to grief of losing pets, losing family and people in her life. And it was painful for me to watch as a therapist. And I couldn't do anything for her. That's her grief. And so she was just there and exposed to this. And it was actually a few weeks of working together and doing integration afterward that she then kind of realized, she was like, oh, and I think it was important to sit with this grief because instead of, when her grandfather passed or her pet passed, instead of identifying that grief, she actually just went back to work, right? She went back and just like produce and make money and plan for retirement and all of these things instead of getting to sit with that grief. But for those few weeks, it was really hard, and I felt a grand sense of powerlessness to do anything except for to be with her where she was at. And so I'm thankful that it did come around, and she did come to these realizations, and was a lot better afterward. But during that time, yeah, it was yeah, painful.
Right. So it's almost like we open ourselves to whatever needs to be seen or healed or integrated, whether we do that through talk therapy or this kind of work. There are bound to be these moments where we go, uh-oh, I opened the can of worms.
Hmm.
What was I
Hmm.
thinking?
Yeah.
And yet it seems like there's such power in this and such possibility in this for people to have an experience that takes them out of kind of their regular shell of humanity, whatever you would call this, and into this different kind of space. How do you see this connected to like somehow to me it's like our society at this point got very secular for many people, not for everyone, but somehow in that secular humanistic kind of rational world, we lost touch of the spirit and the power of the religious experience. So I wonder if we're trying to come back to that somehow, like we're trying to right the ship, you know?
Yeah, and I'm actually, that's one of the things that I really do get excited about with ketamine is in some way that medical science behind it. And I believe medical science is also looking to, F the ineffable, right? We're trying to make sense of the unseen, of the unknown, and find things that help us discover that more. And I do believe that the discovery of ketamine or LSD or the synthesis of MDMA, these are modern chemicals which our ancestors were not exposed to. And I think that our ancestors weren't exposed to because they didn't have the same grievances. They didn't have the same problems, right? And so it's kind of like we've made better tools to cut through the modern confusion that we experience. And so it's wild because in talk therapy, I can work with someone, but when they show up in my office, their nervous system can respond to that just like any other stress, right? And so it can shut down, they can dissociate, they can protect themselves from going to some of these depths. And so that's why talk therapy may take years to uncover some of these things or get to the grieving or loss that causes anxiety. And so what's wild is, we can step into the office and take a lower dose of an anesthetic that anesthetizes the nervous system, and so then you don't have the typical nervous system response. And so then you're kind of in the deep end of the pool, right? And so then it just kind of exposes us to all of the deeper layers of unconsciousness and these things that we might explore. So um, yeah, I think that that's why in our modern time they have been found useful for their ability to connect us to each other, right? Like competition and market capitalism kind of has forced us to separate out and try and specialize to get an angle on that market to make more money, right? But that doesn't necessarily bring us closer in communities, and um, that's been to our detriment, right? Because in my worldview, communities hold knowledge, not just individuals. And so our ability to meet people in community and talk about things is actually paramount to our ability to make meaningful and lasting change. And so in some ways, using psychedelics and therapy are kind of a fast track to that. But it's also a fast track to uncovering sorrow and some of these terrible things that people have too.
Right, right. So kind of the whole picture, the whole possibility. Well, I just appreciate this so much, Rob. You can find out more about some of the things Rob's been discussing at psychedelicsupport.com and also at Rob's website, which is called enduringlovetherapy.com. What any final words, Rob?
Yeah, talk to your doctor. Ask your doctor good questions about psychedelics, right? Like this helps normalize the conversation. And your doctor, if they're doing their job, should be able to tell you whether you're healthy or not for any altered state experience, whether it's an SSRI and an antidepressant or psilocybin or LSD. And so in talking to our doctors and talking to our politicians, it helps normalize this conversation. That's the edge of advocacy that we can engage and talking about it with our friends, right? If you have gone through these assisted therapies, let people know. Don't keep it in the closet and don't hide it away at home. Even if it was just a really scary LSD experience when you were a teenager, talk about it. It's okay, right? Like humans use drugs and medicines, and so helping normalize that conversation just helps at the advocacy level so much.
I love that. Well, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where all of this goes. I mean, obviously, again, there's so much interesting research about trauma. And I think trauma being one of those aspects that kind of haunts modern humanity. It's like, what if there is a way to open people's minds and hearts back after deep trauma through something as simple as a trip? It's quite a trip.
Yeah. And I think, oh, it might have been Bessel van der Kolk. The Body Keeps the Score is a good book on trauma. I'm forgetting there's another one as well, but I just remember that the quote that came out is to remember that the number one response to trauma that humans have is resiliency. We're actually really resilient. And um, so that's the number one response to trauma. And so that folks that don't, and they actually experience things like PTSD, having the usefulness of psychedelics or other, treatments like this, just help them return to that sense of resiliency.
That's gorgeous. What a great place to stop. Thanks so much, Rob. I really appreciate your time and your insights and all that you bring to the conversation, because I think you've got both personal experience and professional experience and kind of that inner and outer wisdom. I love the anthropology PhD.
Thanks.
It's great. Thanks so much. You've been listening to the Best Life, Best Death podcast, and I'm Diane Hullett. You can find out more about the work I do at bestlifebestdeath.com. Thanks so much for listening. So Rob and I thought we'd just keep going for a little bonus material. Gosh, I mean, I think what's so interesting to me is just what you said there in the middle about how there was this promising research and things happening in the 50s, and then things really shut down. What was the year that they shut down? I don't know a lot about it.
Oh, the Controlled Substances Act, I think, was 1972. I
Okay.
would have to
Okay.
I would have to look that up.
Yeah.
But really, it did come from this. It was a response to fighting communism. The government certainly wanted ready, willing, and able young people to go fight wars, and so substances which took them away from that or made them more connected to humanity, just they weren't of any interest, and so they wanted ways to control that, right? And so it also came from this Puritan ethic, as if consciousness needs to be pure in order to be useful. And I think that that's been contradicted. That's not true. And that also was coming, largely from a group of white men that drank a lot, right? Smoked a lot, right? Their exposure to nicotine and tobacco and alcohol were, through the roof. And they're like,
I
well, and
think
everybody needs to be sober.
that's kind of the irony of it, isn't it? Yeah, that it was really this pushback against an indigenous piece that probably most of them had never tried, but they had their 4 drinks at night. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
Well,
found
and so
it
yeah,
so
the
interesting
U.S.
that.
government. Well, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, good.
I was going to say the U.S. government did a lot of research with this. They were actually in that response to the Cold War and wanting to know if other places were using chemicals, for mind altering experiments. They wanted to research this, and so the MK Ultra experiments that took place had a lot of consequences, and so. Actually, the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, was a part of MK Ultra, and so that's kind of scary. That it opened up in his psyche these things that led him to wanting to cause harm to other people.
Right.
And that's just like one example, though, of this being used for nefarious means. And it wasn't like he was using LSD or anything while he was out there in the woods in Michigan, but that his psyche had been cracked open by the government. And who knows what those experiments look like? They're It's actually, I believe the doctor's name was Roquette, Roquet. Um, his method of using psychedelics actually came from his experience torturing people for the Mexican government. And
Yes. Oh,
so realizing that torture generates an altered state of consciousness, then came through and was using psychedelics, but within that would expose people to traumatic images and crazy soundtracks and all of this. But it really was about destabilizing people in hopes that after the leaves settle, that they become, more stable. But it's pretty radical. So there's,
yeah.
a
Yeah.
lot
And
of harmful past
that
as well.
seems that's pretty different to control what the input is, as opposed to sort of see what organically arises. Like the woman you described who had a huge grief experience. I know one woman who did a psychedelic trip, and she said, it was like 5 weeks of talk therapy in one afternoon, and that she sobbed and sobbed, and it felt like, darn, I hoped it would be puppies and rainbows. But she kind of joked on the after. She was like, where was the fun? Where was the joyful trip? But the power in it was that she did some deep work with her family of origin that was really different than anything I think she'd done before, maybe, and maybe touched her psyche in a different way. I'm always struck by how, we talk about how rituals speak to the unconscious, and one of the reasons that rituals are so powerful is because the unconscious doesn't know the difference between me ritualizing something versus actually doing it. And so if I burn old ideas, as far as my unconscious is concerned, we burned those ideas. So I think there's something powerful about that with these psychedelic trips, that there's the possibility of really showing your unconscious something, and stepping into unconscious places that then comes out in simply a different place than you have been holding it your whole life.
Absolutely. I use the metaphor of thresholds a lot. Rites of passage are something that I think are needed more in our culture. We don't have a lot of meaningful rites of passage in our Western culture. And so in some ways, psychedelics offer that. And so, describing a threshold as, you are one way, then you kind of enter into this space of ritual or ceremony, and then afterwards you're different. And yeah, we can definitely use those for these deep experiences to discover who we are or who we want to be, but to also remember that some of these thresholds are entirely celebratory, right? Like weddings and these things, like birthdays and things like that. So even the use of psychedelics to celebrate and be together in community, I think, are just as impactful and useful at that level. So um, isolating it just down to where somebody goes and uses this in an office, I'm like, well, yeah, absolutely useful as a tool, but we've got to return to that sense of humanity and being able to celebrate these things together too.
Which is probably sort of where Burning Man comes in, right? I mean, I think Burning Man is such an example of, there's sort of everything to be found there, but at its base, it's this huge throbbing group of humans, right?
That want to burn the man. And it's taking that right there, the metaphor of burning the systemic violence, burning the institutionalization, and burning it to the ground, and finding radical self-expression, radical inclusiveness, right? Like the 10 principles of Burning Man. And yeah, I'm a burner, and it's wonderful because some of the conversations out there that I've had is, I know one gentleman that their opportunity to go out and do LSD in the desert with a big community of people is what contributes to his mental health throughout the year. Without it, it was dark days, he was suicidal and all of that. And so I'm like, who's to take that away from him? His right to just go out and do LSD once with a community.
Right. And
Um,
somehow thinking that somehow that's problematic compared to people who started drinking heavily during the pandemic, or people who, smoke weed every day just to kind of stay calm. I think there's something really powerful about that, to again put it in this context of humanity, that like these cathartic community events, with or without substances, are kind of like such a big piece of being human, and we're pretty far from them in a lot of ways in a lot of our secular society.
Yeah, and it's wild. DMT, dimethyltryptamine, it's one of the substances that would be decriminalized with the Natural Medicines Health Act if that passes. It's actually native to the body, right? It's endogenous. It's made within the body, and so humans experience it possibly at birth, both for the mother and the child, during death, near-death experiences like car accidents, even things like orgasms. A really powerful orgasm could expose DMT. And so this is a substance that our own body makes. And so our ability to respond to it is, yeah, just so very human at that level. And so why it would ever be decriminalized or made criminal is like just it just blows me away, especially because like my body makes it. So do I become a criminal then for getting high on it?
Right.
It's
It's
like,
like the happiest hormones, like the big happy stress hormones, like a runner's high, right? Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Oh. Well, thanks, Rob, for this little extra bit. I hope that people can, take what they need from this and kind of figure out where to go find this in their communities. I think, as you said in the main segment, I mean, I think if you ask around, you can find people who have connections to these pieces in probably almost every community.
Yeah.